Welcome to Formed. I'm Dr. Elizabeth Klein. I'm a professor here at the Augustine Institute, and I'm here today with my colleague, Dr. Carl Vennerstrom.
Hello.
And we're continuing to talk about the 7 deadly sins. This episode, we're going to talk about envy, and we're spending a whole episode on envy because envy, I think, is maybe not quite the sin that you would think it is. It's not just sort of jealousy or covetousness, just like kind of wanting what other people have, but actually extends much more broadly than this, and I think manifests itself in a lot of really clear ways in society today. So do you want to give us kind of like a basic definition of what envy is?
Yeah. So whereas we formerly encourage you to be angry, we're not encouraging you to be envious. It's always bad. So it is a kind of sadness. So this is sort of getting to what you were talking about. So it's not just jealousy. It's not just you have that or you are that way and I want that and I want to be that way. But it's being sad about a good that another person possesses, either a material good like wealth or some sort of status or something, or even like a spiritual good. So a person who has friendship with God, or maybe a virtue that you lack. And it's not necessarily wanting it for yourself, it's wanting them not to have it because them having it makes you feel sad.
Right. So it can be both and. It's like any kind of sadness that somebody else has a good.
That's right.
And it can be you're sad because you want the good, or it can be just like you're sad that they have it at all and you just don't want them to have it.
Yeah. And maybe it's impossible for you to have it. But yeah, it's just you want it gone.
Right. So like an example of that would be like, I'm mad that Elon Musk has so much money.
Yeah.
Like, and I don't want that much money. I just think that like nobody should have that much money.
Yeah.
It's just like, I don't want that. I don't want that good to exist or whatever.
Yeah, that's right. Out of some malice for the person or like the category of person, or like you don't think he should be evaluated that way.
Right.
But it's sort of out of your control. So it like upsets you that he has that.
Right. Okay. But then there was like a reverse to that, right?
Yeah. So you could also be glad when someone loses some good.
Okay.
This is very prevalent today, I think. Like you can think about it under a few varieties. One is this variety that this Catholic novelist from the 20th century, Walker Percy, talks about. He talks about this in his book Lost in the Cosmos, and he says, like, isn't it strange that when you find out that some tornado ripped through a Kansas town, that like your heart lifts a little because like something interesting is happening, or like I think this happened with the pandemic a lot. It's like, oh, like something's exciting is happening. Like they're telling me I have to stay home, so like this means like the world is interesting, and like, but it's like this is not something to be excited about. Or you could have maybe this malice toward a person, and you think deep down like this person doesn't deserve the favors they've been given or the talents they've been given,
right,
or the responsibility they've given. And when they lose it, you're excited, not because like that stuff was given to you, but just to like see them lose that thing.
Yeah, so this is kind of, sometimes people call this like Schadenfreude, like the kind of rejoicing over the miseries or sort of misfortunes of other people. Okay, so why don't we talk about some ways that like the first form of envy manifests like being sad because someone else has a good, and then maybe talk about the second form. Is there some kind of subtle ways that envy might manifest kind of in your life today where you're desiring a good, you're sad because someone else has a good that you don't have?
Yeah, I think there are practical ones that you could also think of, sort of social media ones. Like, I mean, the practical one that would come to mind would be sort of a friend maybe who is in some other industry or something, gets a big promotion or something. And like you actually like in general sort of want that person to be happy and to do well, but like some part of you is just sort of sad about it. The other one we might think of is being, so I guess this is the other one, but being excited when public figures have falls from grace. I think this is something people sort of like hunt out more.
I think that the second one is particularly prevalent, where there seems to be zeal for people's utter destruction and humiliation in various ways, whether they're like an actor that you didn't like, that you always thought was like a scumbag, or a political figure who's like your enemy in the opposite political party. And
or
like
for a lot of people, it might be actually be a figure in the church or something.
Or figure in the church or whatever. And if something bad happens to them, they get sick, they get found out, they get humiliated. You actually take quite a bit of pleasure in that and are happy in that. And I think this is a very dangerous spiritual temptation, because it's like the opposite of charity, which is like the chief kind of virtue.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. It doesn't desire the good for another when it desires evil. I think it's also a kind of intellectual error about the world. And I think the reason maybe sometimes people are happy when they find out that someone who we didn't know was bad is actually bad is that you think like deep down everything's like evil and everyone's actually secretly evil. And all this stuff about like Mother Teresa and the Nobel Peace Prize, like all these people are hypocrites and they're actually bad. And so whenever we can find out that the truth that like these people are evil, then like it makes us feel sort of more settled in our own minds.
So you think it kind of leads to like self-congratulatory pessimism about like the world and the future of the church, and like that's why it's a kind of like sadness. Yeah. Because in its most extreme form, this kind of leads to despair.
Right.
About the goodness of all people, about hope for the future or what have you.
And I think even if like, let's say you have a sort of nascent desire for the good and for the good of other people, it can kind of stifle that. You might have those sort of two thoughts or desires battling in your soul, that like you want to help people, you want to be helped, you want things to turn out well, but and perhaps there's a kind of cowardice, like since you're worried that it might not, you're not willing to risk it.
And I think I think the other form of envy, the being sad because someone else has a good, that this can manifest in very subtle and insidious ways, especially within the church. So if anyone watching, works at a school or works at a parish, we work at an apostolate, I think it can be very tempting to begrudge other parishes, other apostolates, other priests, their success. And you may be working very hard and you may be praying and you may be kind of doing all the things right, but for whatever reason, like your ministry isn't flourishing, you're not experiencing conversions of students in your class, you're not seeing the fruits of your labors, and it can be easy to begrudge that spiritual good, like to the point of your own spiritual harm, and even like to begrudge it to the point of the detriment of the church, where you're trying to like attack a successful ministry or apostolate or parish because you're not having the same. It makes you sad. It makes you sad that you're not having the same success. And this is something I think as professors we have to keep in mind, or people who work at apostolates, that like if it's a good for the church, it's a good for me, even if it doesn't necessarily redound to my immediate praise or nobody's noticing me, that we're all working towards the same common goal. And so if someone else is having fruit born in their ministry, that we can rejoice with them and try to rejoice with them. This is what like the apostles say to Jesus, like, these people are going around and he's like casting out demons in your name. And he's like, hey,
sounds like he's on our team.
Sounds like he's on our team, right? Like, leave him alone. If he speaks, speaks in my name, he can't speak against me. And I think that as a country, I think this can be difficult to remember. In social circumstances, this can be difficult to remember. And it can become easy to be sad about good things that are happening, which is very strange.
Yeah. I think this is also related to another intellectual error just about these goods, like especially when they're spiritual goods, because for someone to have friendship with God, or for someone's to have sort of these fruits in their ministry or something, this is not something that like people can keep for themselves.
Right. Right.
So one person having it doesn't make your life worse, right? And it's also a kind of lack of faith that God is providing for things.
And there's the parable of the wages of the workers, right, where Christ in the parable, it's the manager of the vineyard, promises the wages to the workers, but at the end of the day, he gives the same wages to all the workers, even who worked only a few hours.
Yeah.
And the parable says, are you angry because I'm generous?
Yeah.
And I think that describes very much the disposition of envy, where you are angry. You are in fact angry or sad.
Because God's good.
Because God is good and God is generous to other people, or even just the winds of fate or fortune has smiled upon a particular person and not you, and you don't think that this person is worthy of whatever good thing that they've had, rather than rejoicing that such goodness exists, rejoicing with a person who, is your friend or colleague or whatever, because of the good that they have gained.
Yeah, and that actually gets to, maybe we'll go back to the disease at some point, but that actually gets to one of the cures that's recommended by these monks and theologians from the past, which is that if you recognize that you're envious and that you have this sadness, there's actually this great proverb. I'm forgetting the exact one, but it says that envy rots the bones. So this is really nice because an appropriate description, because I think envy has a sort of paralyzing effect.
Totally.
Like you lose your vitality and your ability to go out and do things, because in your heart you have in your temple this sadness that you're sort of nourishing and returning to all the time.
Right.
So you can't be turned outward and be upright. Your bones are sort of collapsing beneath you.
Right. Especially when it reaches to the point that you despair of the human condition.
Yeah.
When you have such sadness over, for example, the people who have popularity in this world, or the people who have wealth in this world, that it's kind of like a ubiquitous despair about those who get good things, that it makes it very difficult for you to act at all and kind of hope and
that's
for the
right.
future.
Yeah, and so a solution is to go outside of yourself, and to the person who's rejoicing, you rejoice with them, and to the person who's grieving, you grieve with them, as we're told in Scripture. And the effect of that is all the sort of problems sort of disappear, because the problem of thinking these goods are limited disappears, because when you're rejoicing with a person who rejoices over their spiritual or even temporal good, those goods become your good,
right?
As they sort of always were, and this sadness was this false impression that they didn't also belong to you in some really important respect.
Right. That's really important, I think, because envy is precisely kind of the mistake that you want to make the good thing just your thing, or you want the good thing to be taken from someone else, rather than having the attitude of, a good for the church is a good for me, a good for my best friend is a good for me, and that when I go out of myself in that way, it becomes mine. And I think it's important to say, with both this recommendation, rejoicing with those who rejoice, and in things like almsgiving for avarice or fasting for gluttony, all these cures, it doesn't mean that necessarily you're going to experience this good disposition towards doing those things. Doesn't mean that you're going to fast and be sweet, or that you're going to give cheerfully necessarily, or that you're going to rejoice in the sense that you feel immediately cured. But you can take really concrete actions towards if I'm I'm so jealous of Carl because he got to teach this class I really wanted to teach, or whatever, I can make a concrete action of saying that class you're going to teach is so awesome, do you want me to help you with the syllabus, or whatever. I can make a concrete action to rejoice with you, even if in my heart I'm still kind of bummed. And I think that's true with all of these sins. You can take these kind of concrete actions to the cure, and the fathers love to say that any cure usually comes with pain.
Exactly.
So Augustine loves to say people who are I'll be baptized later. It's what kind of doctor says let the fever get worse before the cure is applied? And he's all people who experience medicine experience some pain. So we can think of this chemotherapy or all kinds of diseases where the cure itself seems at times worse than the disease was. But once you've kind of done the whole process and and you're healed, you realize the benefits.
It's actually kind of a measure that the medicine is working.
Right.
I don't think he says this about envy, but John of Damascus, I think he says about anger. If you suffer an injustice and you don't show an immoderate form of anger and seek vengeance, then as you're beginning in the spiritual life, you're going to feel bitterness in your heart. And so it's sort of like bitterness in your heart is like this first sign of success, because you could avoid the bitterness, right? And this is what Thomas Aquinas says about envy, is that it's this principle from Aristotle that you can't, a human being cannot stay sad and cannot stay and cannot remain in pain forever. Like an animal trying to get out of a trap or something, like he's going to stop being sad. And so it depends on the manner in which he stops being sad. So he actually he takes all of the vices that Gregory the Great sees as the sort of lieutenants or the foot soldiers of envy. He says these are all this attempt to get out of that feeling of sadness. Okay. And so you could take away, you could try to get rid of the good that the person has to get rid of the sadness, or you could try to make it seem like it doesn't exist, or you could convince yourself you have something better. But you're going to get out of the sadness. And actually maybe the feeling of sadness, again, is like the first sign of success. If you just like are willing to sit with it and wait until it disappears, or take a concrete action to
that's like
diminish it.
Against what you feel. Okay, so the first thing you could do to cure envy is to actually take proactive steps to rejoice in a good or be sad at a sadness. Could that be like compassion?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so you could take pity on someone who is suffering, either some material deficit, someone who like loses their fortune or something, or instead of being glad about them, you could go through the motions of feeling sad with them, to make their poverty your poverty.
Because both forms of envy are like the inverse of compassion. It's not it's not experiencing with that person their feeling, but rather the opposite. So like when you're rejoicing with the rejoicing, you're being compassionate, and when you're sad with the sad, you're being
like
compassionate.
Get on their level, literally, like feel that same emotion as them.
But like it also seems to me that there's like another form of compassion that would help fight envy. That like, for example, if you were feeling envy, a form of about maybe a certain rich person or a certain political figure who is popular, and you feel like they shouldn't be for all kinds of reasons, because they're not a good person, because what they're teaching is false or whatever. It seems to me like another way of properly viewing the situation is to actually have compassion on them, because if that's true, if someone's famous just because they're a bad person, then like they might have money but they have nothing, because they actually don't have spiritual life in their soul, and they don't have morality, and they don't have God. And so understanding like to pray for your enemies is actually the truly compassionate act, not to begrudge them temporal goods.
You desire their good. Yeah, that's actually what there's a homily by St. Basil the Great, and he says, a solution for envy, especially of a person who for whom there is some material good, but which they have a vicious relationship to. So like a rich man who suffers from avarice, to get over your envy, you should feel this pity and compassion for the ill he's experiencing, this vice and this sin.
And it seems to me like praying for them and praying for your enemies is a very clear thing that Jesus tells us to do in order to like overcome this false relationship to ultimately to temporal goods. Because if you're spending all your time getting worked up over political favor or wealth or whatever that anybody has that you don't know, it probably means you don't have a very good relationship yourself to temporal goods. Even though you don't have them, you wish you did.
It's just as bad.
Like, Augustine loves to say this all the time to people who are like rich and poor alike, but he says to like the poor person, like, you begrudge the wealthy man his riches, but like, would you begrudge them for yourself? Like, so if you don't have detachment from riches, you're like not yet in a position to judge the rich man.
That's good.
And you have to cultivate actually a sense of pity. I mean, people don't like the word pity because it sounds like looking down on them or something. But compassion for them, true spiritual compassion, which desires their good. And I think maybe for Catholics, a particularly pernicious way that this manifests is that people want certain other people to like leave the church. And this can happen on very like minor levels where you're like, oh, I'm so frustrated with this person at my parish. They don't have proper understanding or respect for the Eucharist, or they're always being annoying or whatever.
But
or they
also be on Twitter.
Or also be on Twitter, or like they think the priesthood should be abolished. Like, why don't they just go leave and be Protestant?
Yeah.
And it's like, I understand that can sometimes be expressed in like a moment of anger at injustice or something, but it seems to me that that's not being compassionate, because to will somebody out of the church is to will their evil.
Yeah.
And so you should instead pray for them, pray that they experience conversion rather than that they experience separation.
And I think one of the helpful things about thinking through these sins sort of in a systematic way is that there's a difference between feeling the temptation to envy and actually being envious.
Right.
And actually, if you have a kind of attentiveness to the temptations, you get sort of these signals to like do different virtues. So when you have this temptation to envy, it's like your signal right away, oh, I need to pray that the person gets, like, if it's a spiritual good, gets more of that spiritual good, has more success. Or the opposite, if it's a person who is in this bad position of vice, to like, oh, that's my signal. This is my cue. This temptation is my cue to actually pray for them. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, everyone, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And we're going to come back with the next episode on interesting collection of sins: sadness, acedia, pronounced different ways, sloth. So if you're interested in this other collection of sadness sins, join us for the next episode.